The biting winter wind howled through the mountains of Calistoga, California, as Julia Vance clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her terrified gaze fixed on the approaching blizzard. The year was 1876, and the young widow of 22 stood trembling on the porch of her isolated cabin, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly that housed her unborn child, the last living piece of her husband, Thomas, who had been taken from her just 3 months prior by a gang of outlaws during a stagecoach robbery. Snow had already begun to fall, heavy and relentless, blanketing the rugged landscape in white. The firewood pile had dwindled to nearly nothing, and the pantry held barely enough provisions to last a few days. As the temperature continued to drop, Julia knew with grim certainty that without help, neither she nor her baby would survive the notorious Sierra Nevada winter that had claimed so many lives before. The cabin had never felt so isolating. Thomas had built it with his own hands, promising Julia a life of adventure in the West after they'd married in Pennsylvania. They'd been so young, so hopeful. Now the very walls that were meant to shelter their growing family seemed to close in on her, a constant reminder of her solitude. Julia wiped away a tear with the back of her hand, watching as the daylight faded faster than usual beneath the storm clouds. She'd have to bring in what little firewood remained before dark. As she stepped toward the edge of the porch, the distant sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Visitors were rare in this remote part of Calistoga, especially with a storm bearing down. Julia's heart hammered against her ribcage. Since Thomas's death, she'd grown wary of strangers. The nearest town was miles away, and law enforcement even further. The rider appeared through the curtain of falling snow, tall and broad-shouldered atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. Julia retreated toward her front door, her hand instinctively reaching for the loaded shotgun Thomas had taught her to use. The stranger dismounted with easy grace despite the heavy sheepskin coat and worn leather chaps that marked him as a cowboy. He removed his hat as he approached the porch steps, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, but kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and steady against the moaning wind. "Name's Boone Daniels. I was passing through when the storm hit. Was hoping you might allow me to shelter my horse in your barn until it passes." Julia gripped the door frame, hesitant. The man stood respectfully at the bottom of the steps, making no move to approach further without invitation. "I don't take in strangers, Mr. Daniels," she responded, trying to keep her voice from trembling. The cowboy's gaze took in her condition, the isolated cabin and the meager woodpile in one swift assessment. His expression softened with understanding. "I can see you're in a delicate situation, madam, but that storm coming in isn't something to face alone." He gestured toward the mountains. "I've seen what Sierra blizzards can do. I'm just offering my help chop wood, tend to any repairs before the worst hits." A particularly fierce gust of wind rattled the shutters, making Julia jump. The baby kicked inside her, as if offering its own opinion on their precarious situation. "I'll sleep in the barn with my horse if that puts your mind at ease," Boone added. "I give you my word as a gentleman." Julia hesitated, weighing her limited options. The man appeared decent enough, and the storm was growing more threatening by the minute. Her baby gave another forceful kick. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Boone reached into his coat and slowly pulled out a folded paper. He held it up. "Army discharge papers, madam. Served with the 2nd Cavalry. You can read them if you'd like." Before she could respond, the skies opened up completely. Snow fell in blinding sheets and the temperature plummeted further. A violent shiver ran through Julia's body. Boone took a tentative step forward, concern etched across his features. "Madam, I don't mean to frighten you, but you need help. I can see you don't have nearly enough firewood, and this storm's going to last days, not hours." As if to emphasize his point, a branch from a nearby pine tree cracked under the weight of accumulated snow and crashed to the ground. Julia flinched at the sound, her resolve wavering. The cowboy looked directly into her eyes. "I'll keep both of you warm," he promised quietly. "You and your little one, you have my word." Something in his steady gaze and straightforward manner broke through Julia's fear. With a small nod, she stepped back from the doorway. "You can come in, Mr. Daniels," she said, "but my husband's shotgun will be close at hand." A hint of a smile touched Boone's lips. "I wouldn't expect anything less, madam, and please call me Boone." "Julia," she replied. "Julia Vance." The cowboy stamped the snow from his boots before stepping into the modest cabin. The interior was neat but sparse, with a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a sitting area near the fireplace where only embers remained. A curtained-off section likely contained her bed. "Need to see to my horse first," Boone said. "Then I'll bring in whatever firewood you have left and start chopping more before we lose the light completely." "The barn's just behind the cabin," Julia said, watching him carefully. Boone nodded and headed back out into the storm. Through the window, Julia observed him leading his horse to the small barn, his movements efficient despite the worsening conditions. True to his word, he returned minutes later, arms laden with what remained of her woodpile. "This won't last the night," he commented, arranging the logs near the fireplace. "Where do you keep your axe?" "On the side of the barn," Julia answered, still standing tensely by the table, one hand on the back of a chair, the other resting protectively on her belly. Boone nodded and disappeared once more into the storm. The rhythmic sound of an axe splitting would soon follow, each stroke precise and powerful. Julia watched through the window as the cowboy worked tirelessly, building a substantial pile before the daylight faded completely. When he finally returned, his coat was covered in snow, but his arms were full of freshly split wood. He stacked it neatly by the fireplace, then expertly rekindled the dying fire until flames danced cheerfully, spreading warmth throughout the cabin. "When's the baby due?" he asked casually, removing his coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "About a month," Julia replied, still keeping her distance. "Maybe less." Boone nodded, his expression revealing nothing beyond polite interest. "You're out here all alone," Julia swallowed hard. "My husband, Thomas. He was killed 3 months ago. Stagecoach robbery near Sacramento." The cowboy's face softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Vance." "Thank you," she whispered, the familiar pain of grief washing over her anew. "When was the last time you ate?" Boone asked, changing the subject with gentle practicality. Julia realized she couldn't remember. "This morning, I think, just some bread." Without asking permission, Boone moved to the kitchen area and began assessing her supplies. "Got any dried meat? Beans? I make a decent stew that'll stick to your ribs." "There's jerky in that jar," Julia pointed, "and some beans in the sack below it, but I need to conserve, Mrs. Vance," Boone interrupted kindly. "You're eating for 2, and from what I can tell, you haven't been eating enough for 1. Let me help." Something about his matter-of-fact concern broke through another layer of Julia's wariness. She sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "I can hunt tomorrow, weather permitting," Boone continued, moving efficiently around her small kitchen. "Replenish your stores. Winter's barely started, and you'll need more than this to see you through." Julia watched as the stranger, this unexpected guardian who had appeared precisely when she needed help, most prepared a simple but hearty meal. His movements were those of a man accustomed to caring for himself, with no wasted motion. "Where were you headed before the storm hit?" she asked, curiosity finally overriding caution. "Nowhere particular," Boone replied, stirring the pot of beans he'd set over the fire. "I work cattle drives mostly, but things slow down in winter. Was thinking of heading to Nevada, maybe find work at one of the silver mines until spring." "You don't have family somewhere?" A shadow passed over Boone's features. "Not anymore. Lost my parents to cholera when I was 16. "No siblings?" "I'm sorry," Julia said sincerely. Boone shrugged. "It was a long time ago. Been on my own since then, except for my time in the army." As they ate the simple but filling stew, the storm's intensity increased. Wind howled around the cabin's corners and snow accumulated against the windows. Julia couldn't help but shudder, thinking of what might have happened had Boone not arrived. "I'll sleep by the fire," Boone said when they'd finished eating. "Keep it stoked through the night." "There's a bedroll in the trunk," Julia offered, pointing to a wooden chest in the corner. "Thomas kept it for hunting trips." As Boone prepared his makeshift bed, Julia retreated behind the curtain to her own small bedroom. Despite her lingering caution, the presence of another human being, especially one who seemed capable of handling whatever the elements threw at them, allowed her to relax slightly for the first time in months. That night, as the blizzard raged outside, Julia slept more soundly than she had since Thomas's death, lulled by the rhythmic sound of Boone occasionally rising to add another log to the fire, faithfully keeping his promise to keep them warm. Morning arrived with an eerie silence. The storm had temporarily abated, though the sky promised more snow to come. Julia awoke to the smell of coffee and the quiet murmur of Boone speaking to someone. Alarmed, she hurriedly dressed and pushed aside the curtain, only to discover the cowboy alone, addressing her cat, Pepper, who had been hiding since the stranger's arrival. "Well, good morning to you too, little fellow," Boone was saying as he scratched the black and white cat behind the ears. "Decided I'm trustworthy enough for your company, have you?" The domestic scene was so unexpected that Julia couldn't help but smile. Boone looked up, catching her expression, and for the first time she noticed how strikingly blue his eyes were. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said. "Made coffee. Found some cornmeal too, thought I'd make johnnycakes if that's all right." "That would be wonderful," Julia replied, surprised by how much more at ease she felt in his presence after just one night. "I should check on the chickens." "Already did," Boone said. "Gave them extra feed. They're huddled together but fine. Saw to my horse too." Julia blinked, unaccustomed to having someone tend to the chores she'd been struggling with alone. "Thank you," she said simply. Boone nodded, then turned his attention back to the small cookstove where the johnnycakes were beginning to brown. "Storm's let up for now, but there's more coming. I can see it in the clouds. Thought I'd use the break to hunt, maybe check your roof for weak spots." "You don't have to do all that," Julia protested weakly. Boone looked at her directly. "Mrs. Vance, Julia, I'm not in the habit of leaving folks in need, especially not a woman in your condition with winter settling in. Unless you'd prefer I move on." "No," Julia admitted, surprising herself with how quickly she answered. I'm grateful for your help." The brief exchange established a new understanding between them. As they ate breakfast, Julia found herself telling Boone about Thomas, how they'd met back east, his dreams of building a life in California, the small orchard he'd started planting before his death. "He sounds like he was a good man," Boone commented. "He was," Julia agreed, a lump forming in her throat. "I don't know how to do this without him," she confessed, her hand moving to her belly. Boone's expression was one of compassion without pity. "One day at a time, that's all any of us can do, and you're stronger than you think." Before Julia could respond, the baby kicked forcefully, making her gasp. "Are you all right?" Boone asked, half rising from his chair. "Yes," Julia assured him, a small laugh escaping her. "The baby's just very active this morning. Here." Without thinking, she reached for Boone's hand and placed it on her belly just as the baby kicked again. Boone's eyes widened in wonder, and for a moment they sat connected by this small miracle. Then, realizing the impropriety of their position, Julia quickly withdrew her hand, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate of me, no need for apologies," Boone said gently, though he too seemed a bit flustered. "It's a remarkable thing, new life." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a small, tentative bridge across the gulf of their circumstances. True to his word, Boone spent the morning inspecting the roof and reinforcing a few weakened areas. In the early afternoon, he took his rifle and disappeared into the forest surrounding the cabin. Julia busied herself with mending, trying not to worry as the hours passed. When Boone finally returned, his face reddened by cold but triumphant, he carried a young buck across his shoulders. "Meat for your smokehouse," he announced, clearly pleased with himself. "Should help see you through a good part of winter." Julia watched in amazement as Boone efficiently dressed the deer in the barn, explaining each step so matter-of-factly that she found herself asking questions. Learning skills Thomas had never had the chance to teach her. By evening, strips of venison hung in her small smokehouse, and they feasted on fresh liver and heart, rich foods that Julia realized her body had been craving. The storm returned that night with renewed fury, confirming Boone's weather prediction. As they sat by the fire, the cowboy produced a small harmonica from his pocket and played soft, melancholy tunes that somehow made the howling wind seem less threatening. "Where did you learn to play?" Julia asked during a pause. "My father taught me when I was a boy," Boone replied. Said a man should always have music in his life, even when times are hard, especially then. Would you mind playing more?" Julia requested shyly. "I think the baby likes it, seems to settle when you play." Boone's smile was warm as he raised the harmonica to his lips once more, his gaze lingering on Julia's face in a way that made her heart beat a little faster. 3 days passed in this manner, with the storm ebbing and flowing but never fully relenting. Boone proved himself invaluable chopping endless supplies of firewood, reinforcing the barn door when it threatened to give way under the weight of drifting snow, and teaching Julia small skills that would help her survive on her own. Each evening they talked more freely, sharing stories of their pasts. Julia learned that Boone had fought bravely during the latter years of the Civil War, had driven cattle from Texas to Kansas, and had even spent time panning for gold in the Sierras, before realizing steady work suited him better than dreams of instant riches. In turn, she told him about growing up the daughter of a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania, her love of books, and her initial hesitation when Thomas had proposed moving west. "You regret coming?" Boone asked on the 4th night, as they sat drinking tea before the fire. Julia considered the question carefully. "No," she finally said. "Despite everything, no. There's a freedom here that didn't exist back east. Thomas felt it immediately. It took me longer, but I understand it now." Boone nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's what keeps drawing me back to these mountains. The space to breathe, to be exactly who you are without apology." On the morning of the 5th day, Julia awoke to sunshine streaming through her window. The storm had finally broken. She found Boone outside, clearing a path from the cabin to the barn, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "Beautiful day," he called when he spotted her on the porch. Julia nodded, suddenly aware that with the storm's passing, Boone would likely be continuing on his journey. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. "Thought I might ride into town," Boone said, approaching the porch. "Get some supplies, maybe see if there's mail for you. Road should be passable by noon." "That would be kind," Julia replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I can give you a list, and money, of course." Boone waved away her offer of payment. "Consider it repayment for your hospitality." "You've more than earned your keep, Mr. Daniels," Julia said formally, retreating behind politeness to mask her confused emotions. Boone studied her face for a moment. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "Weather's clear now, but these mountain storms can turn quickly." True to his word, Boone returned late that afternoon, his horse loaded with supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and most unexpectedly, a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Julia asked when he handed it to her. "Open it and see," Boone suggested, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she'd never heard before. Julia carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a beautiful hand-carved wooden cradle, small enough to sit beside a bed but sturdy and practical. "Boone," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "This is beautiful, but you shouldn't have noticed you didn't have one," he interrupted, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Found it at the general store. Owner's wife makes them. Thought every baby should have a proper place to sleep." Tears sprang to Julia's eyes, the simple gesture of kindness overwhelming her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Truly." That evening, as they enjoyed a meal enhanced by the fresh supplies Boone had brought, Julia gathered her courage. "The road to town is clear now," she said carefully. "It is," Boone agreed, his expression guarded. "I suppose you'll be wanting to continue your journey soon." Julia kept her eyes fixed on her plate. "To Nevada, you said." Boone was silent for a long moment. "Actually, I heard something interesting in town today," he finally said. "Henderson's ranch about 5 miles south is looking for a foreman. Their previous man quit suddenly, headed east to be with family." Julia looked up, hope fluttering in her chest. "Are you considering it?" Boone met her gaze steadily. "Might be. It's good, steady work, place to stay, regular wages." He paused. "Would keep me close by if that might be of interest to you." The implication hung in the air between them. Not a declaration, not yet, but an opening, a possibility for something neither had been looking for but had somehow found in the midst of a winter storm. "I think," Julia said carefully, "that might be very good, for practical reasons, of course." The corner of Boone's mouth twitched upward. "Of course, purely practical." That night, as Julia lay in bed listening to Boone move quietly around the cabin's main room, she placed her hands on her swollen belly and felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, that perhaps the future held more than just survival. The following week brought another change to their developing routine. Boone rode to Henderson's ranch and returned with news that he'd accepted the foreman position, starting immediately but with permission to continue assisting Julia until after the baby's arrival. "Henderson's a decent sort," Boone reported. "Older fellow, runs about 400 head of cattle. Wife passed some years back, 2 grown sons help with the operation. Said I could have the old foreman's cabin once I start full-time." Julia tried to ignore her disappointment at the thought of Boone moving to his own place, however nearby. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, the security of having someone else in the cabin, the easy companionship that had developed between them. "That's wonderful news," she said with forced brightness. "You'll make an excellent foreman." Boone seemed about to say something more but was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Both turned in surprise. Visitors were rare enough in good weather, let alone winter. Boone moved protectively toward the door, hand instinctively dropping to the revolver at his hip. "Who's there?" he called. "Dr. Samuel Wilson," came the reply. making my winter rounds to check on folks in the outlying areas. Julia relaxed slightly. I know him, she told Boone. He treated Thomas once for a logging injury. Boone opened the door to reveal a white-haired man in his 60s, bundled against the cold and carrying a well-worn medical bag. The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Boone, then traveled to Julia and her obviously pregnant condition. Mrs. Vance, he greeted her with a nod. Heard about your husband's passing. My condolences, I see you've found assistance for your situation. Julia flushed, suddenly aware of how their arrangement might appear to outsiders. Mr. Daniels has been kind enough to help me through the recent blizzard, she explained hastily. He's taken a position as foreman at Henderson's ranch. Dr. Wilson's expression cleared somewhat. Henderson mentioned hiring someone new. Good man, Henderson. He turned to Boone and offered his hand. Samuel Wilson, serve as doctor for about 50 miles in any direction, weather permitting. Boone Daniels, Boone replied, shaking the doctor's hand. Pleased to meet you, sir. Well then, the doctor said, returning his attention to Julia. If you don't mind, Mrs. Vance, I'd like to examine you and the baby, make sure everything's progressing as it should. Boone immediately headed for the door. I'll check on the livestock, he said. Give you privacy. When the doctor finished his examination, he pronounced both Julia and the baby to be in good health, though he suggested she needed more rest and better nutrition. That baby's going to be here sooner than a month, he predicted as he packed up his instruments. 2-3 weeks at most, I'd wager. You've dropped considerably. After the doctor left, having promised to try to return closer to her time if weather permitted, Julia shared his prognosis with Boone. All the more reason for me to stay close, Boone said firmly. Henderson understands. Says I can split my time between here and the ranch for the next few weeks, make sure you're set before the baby comes. You've done more than enough already, Julia protested weakly, though she was secretly relieved. Boone looked at her seriously. Julia, you need help. That's not something to be ashamed of. Everyone does sometimes. His simple statement broke something open inside her. After months of holding herself together through grief and fear, trying to be strong for her unborn child, Julia finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She did need help. And more than that, she was beginning to need Boone specifically, not just his strength or his skills, but his quiet companionship, his gentle humor, his steady presence that somehow made each day a little brighter. The realization terrified her. Thomas had been gone only a few months. Was it disloyal to feel this pull toward another man so soon? And yet, the baby would be here within weeks, and the brutal winter would continue for months after. The practical reality of her situation couldn't be ignored. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Julia found herself studying Boone's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He must have sensed her gaze, for he turned to look at her questioningly. Something on your mind? He asked. Julia took a deep breath. I was just thinking about what happens after the baby comes, she said, about you moving to Henderson's permanently. Boone set aside the piece of wood he'd been whittling. Does that concern you? Yes, Julia admitted. I've grown accustomed to your help. To your company, she added more softly. Boone was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. Julia, I need to be plain with you. My interest in staying close isn't just about making sure you have enough firewood or meat in your smokehouse. Julia's heart began to race. What is it about then? I think you know, Boone said gently. But it's too soon. Your husband hasn't been gone long, you're about to have his child. I wouldn't presume Thomas would want me to survive, Julia interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. To live, not just exist. He'd want his child to have a father. Boone leaned forward, his eyes intent on her face. "Is that what you want? Someone to be a father to your baby?" "Yes," Julia whispered, "but not just anyone." The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken feelings. Finally, Boone reached out and took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm not asking for promises," he said quietly. "Just time. Time for you to be sure. Time for us to know each other better. Time for that little one to arrive safely." Julia felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. "Time sounds perfect," she agreed. The next week passed in a curious blend of practical preparation and growing emotional connection. Boone divided his days between Henderson's ranch and Julia's cabin, returning each evening with reports of his work, and occasionally small gifts, a jar of honey from Henderson's wife's beehives, a soft rabbit skin he'd tanned himself for the baby. They settled into a comfortable routine, with Boone taking on the more strenuous chores while Julia prepared meals and continued making baby clothes from fabric she'd ordered months earlier. In the evenings, they talked or sometimes just sat in companionable silence, Boone whittling or playing his harmonica while Julia sewed. The physical changes in Julia became more pronounced as her time grew near. She tired more easily and found it increasingly difficult to move around. Boone noticed immediately, adjusting his behavior to accommodate her needs without making her feel helpless. "I've been thinking," he said one evening as they finished supper. "After the baby comes, you'll need even more help, at least at first." "I know," Julia sighed. "I've been worried about managing everything alone." "You don't have to be alone," Boone said, his voice cautious but determined. "I could stay here in the barn if necessary until you're back on your feet." Julia considered his offer. The idea of Boone living in the cold barn while she and the baby were in the warm cabin seemed unnecessarily complicated and uncomfortable. But the alternative implied a level of intimacy that propriety would frown upon. "What would people think?" she asked finally, voicing her concern. Boone's expression was serious. "I care about your reputation, Julia, but I care more about your safety and the baby's. We could." He hesitated, then continued more firmly. "We could marry, if you were willing. A marriage of convenience to start with." Julia's breath caught in her throat. "Marriage? It would solve the practical problems," Boone explained, his voice steady though his eyes betrayed his nervousness. "Give the baby a name, give you protection. I'd be a father to your child, provide for you both." "And what would you get from this arrangement?" Julia asked softly. Boone looked at her directly. "A family. Something I've wanted for a long time but never found the right circumstance, the right person." The implication that she might be that right person sent a warm flutter through Julia's chest, but she needed to be certain. And if feelings developed. Beyond convenience, a slow smile spread across Boone's face. "I'd say that would be a blessing neither of us expected." Julia looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "It's a big decision." "Of course," Boone agreed immediately. "Take all the time you need." But time wasn't on their side. 2 nights later, Julia awoke to a sharp pain lancing across her abdomen. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, wondering if it had been a dream. Then another contraction seized her, stronger than the first. "Boone," she called, her voice strained. "Boone." He was through the curtain in seconds, hair tousled from sleep but eyes alert. "What is it?" The baby, Julia nodded, gritting her teeth as another contraction began. "It's coming. Too fast." Boone's face showed momentary alarm before settling into determined focus. "All right. What do you need me to do?" "Hot water," Julia gasped. "Clean towels. In the trunk." Boone moved quickly. stoking the fire to heat water, gathering the supplies Julia requested, and helping her into a more comfortable position. As the contractions intensified, he held her hand, allowing her to squeeze with each wave of pain. "I need to check how close it is," Julia said between contractions, her face flushed with exertion. "But I can't see." Understanding dawned in Boone's eyes, followed by a flash of embarrassment quickly suppressed by practicality. "Tell me what to look for," he said simply. Julia gave instructions as clearly as she could, relieved when Boone approached the task with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he brought to everything. His report that the baby was indeed coming soon both terrified and reassured her. "You're doing wonderfully," Boone encouraged, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "Strong as they come, Julia Vance." The labor progressed rapidly. When the moment finally came to push, Boone positioned himself to catch the baby, his face a mask of concentration. "I can see the head," he announced, his voice filled with wonder. "Dark hair, Julia. Your baby has dark hair." With a final, tremendous effort, Julia felt her child slip into the world and heard the most beautiful sound, the indignant cry of her newborn taking its first breath. "It's a boy," Boone said, his voice thick with emotion. "A perfect little boy." He wrapped the baby in a clean towel and placed him on Julia's chest. Looking down at her son's tiny face, Julia felt a rush of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I've been waiting for you." The baby's cries subsided as he nestled against his mother's warmth. His eyes, though unfocused, seemed to search for the source of her voice. "He looks like Thomas," Julia said softly, tracing a finger along the baby's cheek. "Same chin." Boone sat on the edge of the bed, his expression full of tenderness as he gazed at the mother and child. "What will you name him?" Julia looked up at the man who had appeared in her life just when she needed him most, who had kept his promise to keep them both warm, who had delivered her son with gentle hands and now looked at them with such open devotion. "William," she decided. "William Thomas Vance." Boone smiled. "It suits him." In the days that followed, Boone proved himself as adept at caring for a new mother and infant as he had been at everything else. He prepared meals, changed diapers, rocked William when he fussed, and ensured Julia had time to rest and recover. A week after William's birth, Dr. Wilson managed to visit, pronouncing both mother and child to be thriving despite the unconventional circumstances of the delivery. "You did a fine job, Daniels," the doctor said, clapping Boone on the shoulder. "Ever consider medical school?" Boone laughed. "Think I'll stick to ranching, Doc." "But thank you." As the doctor prepared to leave, he glanced between Boone and Julia with obvious curiosity. "Henderson mentioned you're still splitting your time between the ranch and here," he commented. "Can't be easy, especially in winter." "Some things are worth the effort," Boone replied simply. After the doctor left, Julia found Boone standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, his expression thoughtful. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, joining him with William sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I was thinking about choices," Boone replied. "About paths not taken and ones just opening up." Julia studied his profile, suddenly certain of what she wanted to say. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said quietly. Boone turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "And?" "Yes," Julia said simply. "My answer is yes." The joy that transformed Boone's face was breathtaking. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure," Julia confirmed. "It may have started as convenience, but it's become much more than that, at least for me." Boone reached out, gently cradling her face in his palm. "For me as well," he admitted. "I never expected to find you, Julia Vance. Never expected to feel this way again, or maybe for the first time, truly." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. William stirred between them, making a small noise of protest at being slightly squeezed. They broke apart with soft laughter, looking down at the baby who had, in his own way, brought them together. "So, Mrs. Daniels," Boone said, testing the name, "when shall we make this official?" "As soon as the weather allows travel to town," Julia replied, smiling at how right the new name already felt. "But in my heart it's already done." Spring arrived in Calistoga with a burst of wildflowers, and the sweet scent of apple blossoms from the small orchard Thomas had planted. Julia stood on the porch, watching as Boone worked in the garden plot they had expanded together. William securely strapped to his back in a carrier Boone had fashioned from leather and canvas. At 3 months old, William was thriving, a happy, sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's expressive eyes. He adored Boone, quieting instantly whenever the cowboy held him, as if recognizing the man who had helped bring him into the world. They had married 2 months earlier, as soon as the mountain passes were clear enough for travel. The ceremony had been simple, performed by the town's pastor with Henderson and his wife as witnesses. Julia had worn her best dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Boone had stunned her by appearing in a new suit, his usually untamed hair neatly combed. "You look very handsome," she had whispered as they stood before the pastor. "And you," Boone had replied, his eyes never leaving her face, "are the most beautiful sight I've ever seen." Their vows had been traditional but spoken with such genuine feeling that the pastor had commented afterward that theirs was among the most sincere ceremonies he'd ever conducted. The transition from neighbors to husband and wife had been surprisingly easy. Boone continued working at Henderson's ranch, riding out each morning and returning each evening, but the cabin was now truly their home. He had built an addition for William's room and was already planning a second bedroom for future children. Julia smiled at the thought, her hand drifting unconsciously to her stomach. She hadn't told Boone yet, but she suspected their family might be growing sooner than they'd planned. The idea filled her with quiet joy rather than the fear she might have expected. Life wasn't perfect, of course. There were difficult days when Julia missed Thomas acutely, when she worried whether she was dishonoring his memory by finding happiness so soon after his death. On those days, Boone gave her space, never pushing but always ready with a gentle word or touch when she was ready. "He'd want this for you," Boone had said once, holding her through tears on what would have been Thomas's birthday. A good man would want the mother of his child to be safe, to be loved. And she was loved. Boone showed it in 1,000 ways, in the careful way he tended the orchard Thomas had planted, in his patience teaching her to shoot more accurately, in the journal he kept of William's growth to ensure the boy would someday know every detail of his early life. Most of all, he showed it in the way he looked at her, as if still amazed by her presence in his life. That look never failed to send warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling of coming home she hadn't expected to find again. Now, as Boone straightened from his work in the garden and turned toward her, that same look crossed his face. William spotted her too, his little legs kicking with excitement as he babbled happily. "I think someone's ready for his lunch," Boone called, crossing the yard with long strides. "And possibly a new diaper." Julia laughed, taking William into her arms and breathing in his sweet baby scent. "And what about his father? What is he ready for?" Boone's eyes darkened slightly as he leaned in to kiss her, a kiss that still held the power to make her knees weak after months of marriage. "That, Mrs. Daniels," he murmured against her lips, "is a conversation best continued after our son is asleep." Julia blushed, but held his gaze. The easy affection between them, a daily gift she never took for granted. As they entered the cabin together, no longer a place of fear and isolation, but a true home filled with warmth and love, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed in less than a year. From a pregnant widow standing afraid on her porch as winter closed in, to a wife and mother with a future full of promise, all because a cowboy had knocked on her door and promised to keep them warm. That promise, made and kept on a snowy night, had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined. As Boone built up the fire and Julia prepared to feed their son, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the storm that had brought this man to her door, and the courage they'd both found to open their hearts to unexpected love. Years later, when William was old enough to ask about his name, about his father, Julia would tell him two stories, one about the brave, kind man who had given him life but never had the chance to hold him, and one about the extraordinary cowboy who had arrived in a blizzard and stayed to become the father William needed. Both men, she would explain, had shaped his life in different but equally important ways, but that was for the future. For now, Julia was content to live in the present moment, surrounded by the love of the family they had built together, one day, one choice, one act of courage at a time. The evening air carried the scent of pine and the distant promise of summer, as Boone lifted William high above his head, eliciting delighted giggles from the baby and a warm smile from Julia. This was her life now, unexpected, challenging at times, but filled with a deep, abiding joy she would never take for granted. As twilight settled over Calistoga and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky, the Daniels family gathered on their porch, secure in the knowledge that whatever storms life might still bring, they would weather them together, kept warm by the love they had found in the most unexpected of circumstances.